And now we would like to take it from a personal application of APIs to more of a business side and how you can use it in the context of your workplace. So with that, Francesco and Maurizio, take it away.
Yeah, I introduce you Maurizio Ranaboldo is our global CTO, and he is going to present you one of our solutions. Maurizio, you can take over.
Hi, everybody. Sophia, thank you very much for your presentations of the APIs. That was very good. And I would like to tie you into your explanation and take it into the Querlo version of this. So that we have seen what APIs are, what they can do, what they can be used for, and how to interact with them, how to use Postman to, explore them. That's the best tool to do this. And now we're going to be seeing how to do this with Querlo specifically. So as Sophia was saying earlier, generally speaking, when you are triggering an API endpoint, you're going to be using either a GET request or a POST request. Then there are delete requests, update requests. There are various kinds, depending on the way the API is designed. A different method may be requested, may be required for whichever operation you need to do. For what concerns Querlo, we have two ways to interact with endpoints. We use our GET calls, like I will show you in a moment here, directly over to an endpoint, like Sophia was doing earlier, or we implement middlewares otherwise. What is a middleware? A middleware is a short script. Generally, we write them in PHP, but when they get more complex, we may use Java or any other kind of language or scripting language, as you prefer, you're familiar with. And we use this program to convert and translate the input of the API and convert it in a way that is usable directly for the chatbot. So this is usable, is important, for example, when you want to interact with the database, like was asked before. If you want to interact with the database doesn't have an API itself. Usually you have to connect to it with a, I don't know, a JDBC or DBC or whatever kind of connector. And that is usually implemented in a language. Like, for example, in PHP, you will have the MySQL driver, for example, and you can build a middleware endpoint on top of it. And then you can use this middleware endpoint to trigger a specific operation onto the database. So let's say you want to write a new record into your database. What you will do is you create a middleware specific to that kind of record. And this middleware will take a few parameters as the input, which can be sent from the chatbot, and then execute the actual write. So this is the purpose of the middleware, being a piece of script, a piece of software that's in between the chatbot and the final destination, be that a database or even an API. Why would you use this with an API? You would use this with an API if, for example, you needed to make multiple calls to obtain a result. Like one case in the real world that we have found is, for example, if you want to post a leave request to SuccessFactors, which is an SAP application that's very popular, you would need, for example, to create an attachment first if you needed to send some documentation, for example. So first you will need to trigger the endpoint in the API to upload the image that you have gathered with the chatbot. And then you have to actually make your post request with the data coming from this first request. So for anything that is a little bit more complex than a simple GET call or POST call to your API, you want to build a middleware. Now, to see this from the Querlo point of view here, I created a very simple chat in which I collect a parameter at the beginning by asking an open answer question. You can see here that my parameter is then stored into the scope variable param, which I then use to make my GET request. So what we do here is we reach a checkpoint in which we create this get from remote command. This is where the magic happens if you want. Here you can see the endpoint that I'm calling. And you can also see now it's actually covered by my Zoom. Over here, you can see that this is where I'm printing the variable within the URL. So what I'm doing here is the equivalent of what I would do on Postman by calling this endpoint and specifying this variable param as my parameter. Now, generally on Querlo, when you want to use a variable, you will print it by using the single curly bracket. Within a URL, you want to use the double curly bracket for encoding reasons. You want to make sure that every character that is not usable in a URL is escaped correctly. And to do this, you use the double curly bracket. Now, anything that is then generated into this endpoint is finally stored into this variable. So any structure that is fetched from this endpoint is then stored into this variable and is then accessible later on. So for example, if I call this address, what I see is this, which is very similar to what Sophia was showing earlier. This is a an endpoint that I built for a specific demo that I will show you later, which is nothing more, nothing less than a JSON structure like the one that was described earlier. Now, to see it a little bit better, I had it formatted here. You can see the actual tree over here. There's a question, answers, and so on and so forth. Now, once you run your get call, the result is then usable, like I was saying, within our scope. So we can see here that I have this print. I fetch the fetch.s, where s is here, one of the variables contained within the scope that was fetched over here, pushed within this fetch, which acts as a variable container for all the objects that were contained within the request. So this is how we do integrations with anything from the server side. So this is very important for getting into existing processes as well, not just triggering public APIs or existing services, but also to extend the functionality of Querlo itself. Whenever you want to do, for example, some complex validation, which, for example, entails checking against a query on a database or against some more complex business logics, which may not be as simple to implement graphically, what we have done is, instead of overcomplicating the interface and make it hard to understand, what we have done is we just relayed it to the backend systems. So you can just create your little script, your little middleware, which is usable for any kind of validation you want to do, and you are not bound to any language, because Querlo, being so agnostic to the languages you use, allows anybody to use it. Let's say you're proficient in PHP, then you will use that. Let's say you're proficient in Node.js, you will prefer to use that. Or if you use Python, like was mentioned earlier, everything works as long as you respect the JSON format as we have designed here. Basically, all you have to do is create this object that contains this s=1 variable, which is the only reserved keyword, which is used to determine whether the call was successful or failed. And that's all you have to do to make this work. Now, to move one step further, you can also use complex structures like the one we were seeing over here to do things with these variables. You don't need to only print them. You have other possibilities. In this case, for example, I created this this demo to show you how a question can be rendered dynamic by creating a data source. Now, this format that we were looking at over here is not just a random format, but it's actually the format used for the overriding of question structures. So what you can do here is you can generate this structure with all the, let's say, with different text for the question prompt, and with different answers, and with different additional variables, even if you need them to be able to do more work later afterwards. And all this can be generated from the server, and then it can be sent over to the chatbot in order to change the way the question is actually displayed. So let's see how it works over here. This is the call that we have made earlier, that we have seen. And this is how the question is designed statically within the graphical interface. We can see we have a text for the question, which is just, this is the original question before override. While instead, our actual text is question goes here. So once we run it, we will be seeing question goes here instead, which is not what is written over here. Then we have created two branches, branch A and branch B. These are used as branches rather than answers, because from a graphical point of view, you can generate branches in order to continue your flow and divide whatever action may happen, whether the user ends up on branch A or branch B may be different. So you cannot know how many answers there are going to be, right? Because let's say the override generates 10 different answers. You do not know how many there are going to be. What you can know is how many different outcomes there can possibly be depending on the answers. So what we can do is design the branches like I did here, branch A and branch B. When you go over here, you will see that the answers are then declared towards a certain branch, not an answer itself, because the answer becomes what you override it with, but the branch. So you create as many answers as you want, but you can decide on which branch those answers will bring the user. So for example, here I have the first one that goes to branch A, the second one also goes to branch A, as the text actually says, and the third one goes to branch B. So if we try this out, you will see that we have 3 buttons, which are not the 2 buttons that we have here, but there are 3 in fact, which are the same as we see in the JSON format. And if I choose one of these 2, I go into the A branch. If I go onto this one, I go into the B branch. And this is the text that I saw, and this is what happens afterwards. So if we go and compare this text with what is happening here, then this is where we are, right? So this is a way to use the integration with a backend system to render your content dynamic, to control the flow of the chat, and to represent the data that you need within a multiple choice question. Now, there are other ways to render your chat dynamic. In the interest of time, unfortunately, I cannot show you everything. This is just a quick example of how to integrate with the backend system to get some information that you can then use to make your chat more dynamic and more complete. This is what the first example that we saw at the beginning of today's session could be using to make the data that was shown actually dynamic. Since we were seeing this chat earlier, we can see that the data that was shown to us was all written and hard-coded over here, but nothing forbids me for changing this 64% into a variable that comes from the server through my original get call over here. Right, so this is it for what concerns the integration with the server. As you can see, it's fairly straightforward and fairly simple. It's just a matter of leveraging APIs, the way Sophia was describing. And keep in mind, any call is always a server to server. So you will never have a security issue here because the chatbot in the client does not communicate to the API directly, but it communicates through the server, which is also very important. Because if you are in an enterprise or even not a particularly important situation, you do not really want anybody to tamper with the data directly onto the API. You always want to filter it. All right, so Querlo also allows the integration with the client, not just with the server. What we've seen so far is a server-to-server integration in the interest of triggering APIs and middlewares. Now, one other thing I wanted to show you is the integration with the front-end system. Now, as you probably have seen with the previous presentations by Francesco and Jim, you might have seen that usually we embed a chatbot within a website, or there is some sort of a host website, a container, which may or may not have some functionalities. Now, here we have simple chat that allows us to see how the chatbot can actually control the website in which it is hosted, which is a completely different way to make an integration. So for example, here I have my chatbot. It's currently on this page, as you can notice the address. If I click OK over here, I will trigger an event within the chatbot script, which is very similar to this one. It's just a checkpoint with a command such as this. And this changes the page by sending an event over to the host website. Now, the chatbot is the guest and the host website has a way to handle these events. Now, on our documentation over here, you can see how this would be done on the client side. This is how you create it. This page is very thorough. If you want to go through it later, please feel free. All the documentation is over here, free for you to check out. So what you do is you create a new command over here. You select all whatever options you need. Everything is free because it's then configured by the programmer on the on the host website. And then on the host website, you have to put an event handler, which is this piece of code, which basically is a way to capture the event that is thrown by the guest chatbot. So the chatbot generates this event, which you needed to capture and do something about. Now, what we have just seen, which is the change of page address, the URL has changed, is triggered by exactly this example over here. So what happens is we add first an event listener to the window, and this event listener then calls this function, which then handles the data that's passed over to it by the chatbot. So the chatbot will say, basically, I want you to navigate page, where? To this page. And the handler does exactly this. It navigates the page by taking the address that was passed, the URL, and changing the window location by using the command on JavaScript to change the page, the URL on the current window, right? So this is how you can send a command from the chatbot to the guest in order to control it. Now, to give you a further example of the power of this integration, I will show you that, for example, here we have currently 12 itineraries. We obviously have all the filters as you normally would in any e-commerce. So this is just a regular page, a regular e-commerce, right? You can do whatever you want, or you can just follow the chatbot that can give you some suggestions. So I was saying here we have 12 itineraries. As I browse them, I don't really know what to choose. So I just keep going. I say, all right, show me what you got. I want to leave in this period. And what happens over here? The number of itinerary has changed to 4. How did this happen? This happened by shooting another command to the guest website, which in turn triggered its endpoint for adding this filter. Right, so afterwards, one more thing that we can see about the integration is if I want to choose a journey, for example, I can use a parameter in the URL to make the chatbot actually context aware. What happens here is this is a single chatbot that's the same on every page. Every product has always the same one. But by passing a parameter to the chatbot can then fetch information specific to that product. So I do not need to create 200 chatbots, 200 scripts, all different depending on whichever product I want to show. I have a, let's say I am the owner of a hardware store or of a computer hardware store, and I have 200 different products. It would be unthinkable to create 200 different scripts, one for every product. It would be ridiculous. So what I would do instead is I would just add one more field within the database of my products, which will contain the description of the product that I want to show through the chatbot, which is, for example, this one, right? Then we can always make things more complicated. This is just for the sake of the current display. So by knowing that this is product number 10, the chatbot will go and fetch the information, and then it will be able to display the proper data. And this is sent to the chatbot through yet another command of integration, which is the get client variable, which is similar to the previous one that we saw, but it's in the other direction. So we know that the client event handler is an event that is raised from the chatbot and then handled by the host. In this case, instead, we have a request that's also triggered by the chatbot, but to get a value from the guest. So the communication here is in the other direction. We have the website give something to the chatbot to be used. Now let's see this example, how it works. And it's very similar to the other one because we are still using the same event listener, but in this case, we are using a different message type. So if before the message type was client event, as you can see here, this is a client event of type navigate page. Here instead, we have a message type of type get client variable. And the variable that we want to fetch is the variable called the my client variable, like in this example. So this same handler, which is the same one as we saw earlier, has a different function of actually generating this signal for the guest chatbot and pushing over the variable to it by using this line of code. So you do source, which is the source of the event, post message, the value, and the origin. So by doing this, I will know within my chatbot scope that the variable that has been requested, which in this case is my client bar, has this value, and from now on I can use it within my scope. So this allows me to take this 10, which is known by the by the host website, and push it over to the chatbot, which then can make an informed get call, such as this one, by specifying that same variable in my request, making the data dynamic and possible to be shown in this page. Now, I think this is about it for the main comments. If anybody has any question or if I haven't been clear, please ask away.
Questions, reaction, thoughts?
Hi, Maurizio. This is Maria. Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Pretty amazing work. I had a quick question regarding VR headset and using a web bot in a headset. How would that work?
Using a VR headset. Well, that depends what you want to do with the VR headset. There are many things that can be done with a VR headset. For example, you may think about using it to see a virtual environment, which is usually a 360-degree picture or video or I don't know, all sorts of things. What we generally do for integrations with specific purposes is we either develop a separate widget or we just use the current implementations through APIs. Now, what did you exactly have in mind with using the VR helmet? Do you have any specific use case that you had in mind to which we can elaborate further?
So just making a request from Oculus Go. I mean, I'm doing some work in VR, and let's say I wanted to make a request or the user to be able to interact, you know, and get some data or interact with the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, here we are talking about chatbots mainly. So the VR experience is mainly an immersive experience. So with the chatbot, you can generally interact mainly with the text or with voice eventually. The VR experience is more graphical than this, so it doesn't really apply all that much, I'm afraid.
But that's good to hear about the voice, because you definitely can do that, you know.
Yeah, of course, that's something you can do. So let me take this one step further. Earlier, Sophia was mentioning one kind of distinction about the integration is the channels. that she was showing earlier, like let's say you want to use Telegram, WhatsApp, or Facebook Messenger. Those are all channels that we can place on top of our chatbot. So this is our chatbot, right? The logics, the brain of our chatbot, and this resides on our server. How we use this, how we interact with this is the channel. So the ones I've shown you so far, and Francesca has shown you so far, these are all using our channel, which is our HTML5 client, which is pretty advanced compared to many others. So we prefer to show this. It has many multimedia functions that are not available on other clients. But obviously, you can use different kinds of channels. And this also includes voice, because you can definitely use a voice integration to trigger the same buttons. So if you are using, for example, an NLU system, you can use a speech-to-text system to interact with the NLU. Nothing forbids this. So this is probably the way the chatbot would work within VR, because VR, it gives you this immersive experience in your environment. You can eventually touch things that aren't really there, and you can talk to it to execute commands. And this is how the chatbot would fit in there.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate that.